Have you ever wondered whether an index-linked contract is right for your business? Well, we at NYSHEX understand how sensitive rates and contract terms are. So we created an Excel simulator that you can use to explore all the different options that are available to you as you think about your contracting strategy. Let's dive in. To access our index-linked contract simulator, just click on the link down below and you'll be able to get access. It's all free and you can use it however you would any other Excel file. When you first download the file, you will land on the Read Me First sheet. And this Read Me First has some information about how you will use the simulator. This is designed to help folks who are trying to decide whether they should make an index-linked contract. It helps them make that decision. So what does the simulator do? Well, it allows you to easily compare different contract structures and terms based on your own historical data, allowing you to extrapolate those patterns and terms into various simulations, and then hopefully help you decide on the right type of contract for yourself. So there are 3 different steps in this process. Step number 1 is we're going to create a contract baseline. Step number 2 is we're going to create an actual rate baseline. And for those of us in the industry, we know very well that there can be a big difference between what is signed or agreed to at the time of the contract and what's actually paid in the market when you have to deal with blank sailings and now you need to find an alternative carrier or an alternative route to market or GRIs and things like that. So that's step number 2. And step number 3 is where we're going to run a whole host of various simulations. And we're going to end off by just giving you a summary of some of the things you can do with this file to keep it updated. So every week the new NYFI data comes out and there's an easy way for you to keep this current. So a couple more things that you should know is what happens to your data? Nothing. The data is basically all in the Excel file, and you can treat it just like you would any other Excel file. NYSHEX and no other company has access to your Excel files. So it's entirely yours. What's the catch? There is no catch. This is completely free. You can use it however you like. Just keep in mind that since this is a free tool, NYSHEX doesn't take any responsibility or liability for how you might use this data, and we reserve all rights to the NYFI or NYSHEX trademark and the intellectual property within the file. And then the question might be, why consider NYFI as one of the potential indexes that you might link your contract to? So we'll come back to that right at the very end. But what I'll say for now is that the main reason why NYFI is a great choice as an index is because it's based on actual shipped on board rates, aka moving rates, which are very different to rate that might be quoted or even booked on. Those are considered to be paper rates. And the big difference here is that a lot of quotes are made every day, but not that many quotes get converted to actual bookings. Whereas moving rates, which are based on an actual shipped on board container with a order to bill invoice, is a far more reliable mechanism to be able to calculate an index. And of course, the NYFI index is based exclusively on moving rates, which of course is much more reliable than paper rates that we just described. So let's go into step number 1, establishing the contract baseline. So this sheet gives you a way to capture this. There are 4 potential contract periods that you can input, and there are 4 different simulations, simulation A, B, C, and D. And so you can use whatever contract periods and simulation period you would like. Just keep in mind that the NYFI data, which we will be baselining off, is only updated for up to 2 years prior. So just keep that one in mind. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to assume that we're going to run a simulation based on the Asia US West Coast trade for 40-foot high cubes. I'll show you how you do this. You select these various options here. In fact, I've already prepared some of this data so I can just copy and paste it, make it easy. And then I'm going to pop in here my contract validities and my contract rates. Now keep in mind, these rates that I'm putting in here are the rates that you would have signed, including all mandatory surcharges, not including local charges, not including landside charges. Very important, but it's all mandatory charges at the time the contract is signed. And if you're interested, you can access the NYSHEX or NYFI methodology, and you can see exactly why and how these charges are broken down. And the goal here is to ensure that whatever contract rate you put into the simulator is consistent with the relevant NYFI index, which you'll see how we tie back to later in the simulation. So here we've completed step number 1. We have input our contract baseline. Now moving to step number 2, the actual rate baseline. As we talked about before, the goal here is to compare historic data and run simulations based on that. We mentioned that you sign a contract, but you don't always pay the price that you agree on the contract. There are many reasons why, for example, peak season surcharges, general rate increases, but you may also have situations where you cannot load on your contracted carrier and therefore you have to load on a backup carrier. And these are the reasons why your actual rates can change quite significantly from your contract rates. So I'm going to go in and populate all of the contract actual rate data and also my volume for the time period here. I've pre-prepared this on a separate page, so I can come in and pop that in. And there you see it's all updated up until the most recent week's worth of data. Now we're ready to jump into step number 3, run simulation. So I'm going to click on these 3 cells for each of the simulations. And I'm going to say for this simulation A, let me see what would happen if I made a weekly settlement time frame. That basically means my price that I pay according to the contract is going to be set based on the weekly index that I select, in this case, the NYFI. You can also select a monthly or a quarterly option, but for now, let's stick with weekly. The offset type, let's assume that you've got the opportunity to choose a percentage or a dollar value. Let's assume here that we're going to take a dollar value. And over here for the offset value, let's assume that we're going to make that minus $300. And this is based on the fact that in the past, maybe on average, we have paid less than $300 what the market average is, and therefore we assume that that's a fair assessment for our size of volume, our relationships with our carriers, and going forward we'll be able to maintain an offset of say $300. Again, that's always entirely up to you and your carrier what you're able to negotiate, but it's always helpful to have a baseline based on what has previously been negotiated with your carriers. So that's the first simulation. Let's quickly finish the remaining simulations. Let's try again another weekly one, but here instead of doing a dollar value offset, we're going to do a percentage offset, and here we're going to say it's minus 10. Here we're going to do simulation C. We're going to say this, we're going to do monthly. We'll do it with a percentage offset, and let's say it's minus 10. And then here we'll do simulation D, and this time we'll do it quarterly based on a percentage offset, and we'll do minus 10. So these are the 4 different simulations, and once again, you can simulate any way you like, and you can simulate different trades, different container size types. Now, keep in mind, if you wanted to change the trade or the size type, you do need to go back to step number 1 in order to do that. And also keep in mind that if you want to be able to simulate 20-foot rates instead of 40-foot GPU or high cube rates, you do need to have access to NYSHEX Pro. In order to get access to NYSHEX Pro, you need to be a data contributor. Feel free to reach out to someone from NYSHEX and we'll tell you how to go about being a NYSHEX data contributor and be able to get access to NYSHEX Pro. But everything that you see on the screen right here is available to everyone, whether or not you're a data contributor or even a NYSHEX member. So with that said, in this specific example, we're looking at the 3 different contract periods that I input the data for before and the 4 different simulations. By the way, if I had included 4 different contract periods, I can click this little plus sign here and it'll open up for me the remaining contract periods so I can simulate this. And now that we've set this all up, I can go through and look based on each simulation, what have I actually shipped based on my historic volume? What was my contractor's spend? What was my actual spend? And again, we can show this to you in total terms as well as in a rate per container term. And then here we can show you what your simulated spend would have been had you used the NYFI Asia US West Coast 40-foot high cube and a GP rate with a weekly settlement, a dollar value offset, and a $300 discount to the index price. And that would give you a simulated saving based on your actual spend of 9.1 million. And that equates to about an $81 per container rate differential. And here you can see basically the offsets compared to NYFI in these cells over here. So this is for the first contract period. Let's take a look down to the second contract period. Here we see contract period number 2, and you can see the saving is around $200 per container, or minus a $36 million loss. And when we get to this, we'll show you how this worked out. And then finally, in contract period 3, you can see that the saving is at $69 per container and a $22 million saving here in contract period 3. And just like we've done for this construct, you can see how it compares to the percentage construct. The difference is in some cases fairly material. And over here, you can see how it looks when you're dealing with a monthly settlement time frame and even a quarterly settlement time frame. So this is fairly straightforward. What I find is usually quite helpful is to be able to see this visually. So in order to see this visually, you just scroll down, and here you can see a chart. And this is the simulation A, where we're running with a weekly settlement and a $300 offset per container. And here you can see the blue shaded area is the actual rate paid. The dark blue dotted line is the contract rate that was agreed to at the time of the contract. Mint colored line is the market rate as per the NYFI. And of course, the orange colored line is the simulated rate, basically taking into account that $300 delta based on the offset. So here's the scenario where it's a fixed dollar value per container. Here's the scenario where it's to 10% difference. And obviously you can see that when it's a 10% difference at the high end, the splits are pretty wide compared to the fixed rate. But when you get down to the lower rate levels, the deltas are not as wide. So that's an interesting way to see how this materializes. Then we take a look at the simulation C, where we're running on a monthly settlement period using a 10% offset. And here you start to see there's a bit of a lag in the orange chart compared to the mint color chart that's showing the NYFI rate. And that's, of course, because you have to wait until the end of the month before the index is able to be calculated and to produce the settlement price on the contract if you're using a monthly offset. Now, one of the challenges with a monthly offset is that you can be shipping in periods, say, for example, the week after April 6th, where the spot rate has started to come down, but you're actually paying a premium over that spot rate. And that's, of course, because of the lag. And then you have the opposite effect. When the spot rate goes up, you don't necessarily pay that increased price until a few weeks later. And that's, of course, because of this monthly settlement period as opposed to the weekly settlement period. And now we get down to this final scenario or simulation where we're looking at the quarterly offset. And here's where there is a very significant difference in the actual price that is paid and historically the price that you would have paid had you shipped under normal conditions compared to what you would pay in this simulated scenario. One of the things you always need to be mindful of, if you have a contract where the price difference in the settlement is significant compared to the actual spot market, is that you do tend to see a break in the incentive structure. So for example, in a case where there's a very big difference, in this case, it looks like a $5,200 rate in the NYFI spot rate compared to a simulated rate of only $1,800. In this case, you can imagine that a carrier, even if they've got a good contract that's index linked, might have an incentive to curtail allocation, and vice versa when you're dealing with a price whereby the simulated rate based on the quarterly settlement period is $6,000, but the actual spot rate for that period might be $4,500. Of course, now you've got a big incentive not to fulfill that index link contract. So that's why, just generally speaking, a quarterly settlement period is not as good as a weekly settlement period for the purpose of aligning those incentives. So once again, this is how you can run these different simulations. If you click on the cells, you can read how each of these formulas are calculated. There's no mysteries to that. That's the beauty of Excel. And now I want to get on to how do you keep your NYFI data relevant? Well, the answer is you go to this tab, and here you can see all of the data that's been pulled through from the NYFI. You'll see that in some cases, the beta trades, and these are trades where the index data is being produced. However, it hasn't been moved to production yet. We're still in the process of testing. In the beta trades, you aren't able to access the data unless you have the NYSHEX Pro version. But once the data moves out of beta into production, of course, then this becomes available to everyone. I just thought I'd call that out. And then here you can see how you go about getting access to this data. You log into the NYFI screen, you click this little down arrow, the Excel file gets produced, and then you simply copy and paste the Excel data into the column over here, and you can keep this file updated. So it doesn't take a lot of effort to make sure that this file is updated every time you want to perhaps rerun a set of simulations. And then the last thing I just want to spend some time talking about is what I talked about earlier in the conversation. Why would you want to use a NYFI linked contract as opposed to some of the other indices that are out there? So very quickly, the index you select really does matter. As I already talked about, when you have an index that or an index linked contract that closely follows the actual market price, you have a good opportunity to align the incentives. And when those indexes or your indexing contract doesn't really follow the actual spot market, those incentives can become misaligned. So that's very important. And once again, this is what we believe is so important with regards to moving rates versus these quoted rates. And quoted rates, keeping in mind, don't always relate in containers actually being shipped. So that's the big difference here. And then finally, as you think about having a contract where the price is constantly changing based on changes in the spot market. That's what happens with an index-linked contract. You may want the ability to hedge, and that basically means prevent you from being exposed to massive spikes should the spot rates suddenly increase. With NYFI, you do have the opportunity to hedge. So these are the three main points of difference. First one is, as already mentioned, the NYFI is based on actual moving rates. It's never based on quoted rates. It's supported by leading banks, brokers, and the largest exchange in the world, which is the Intercontinental Exchange. And then finally, NYFI is always free for carriers, shippers, and forwarders. NYSHEX makes revenue from selling software to manage your contracts and the performance on those contracts. We're not looking to make any revenue from the index that we produce. And this is always going to be free for carriers, shippers, and forwarders. So why is it that leading global carriers, shippers, and forwarders trust NYFI? Well, we cover all the major global trade routes. It's fair and transparent with the FMC's regulatory oversight. It's calculated based on millions of shipped and invoiced spot rates. And very importantly, it's governed by a balanced board of major shippers, forwarders, and carriers. So frankly, NYSHEX makes no decisions in how this index is produced. All of the decisions are in fact made by a balanced board of shippers, forwarders, and carriers. So a question we get all the time is, how is it that NYFI compares to the SCFI, meaning the Shanghai Container Freight Index? And that, of course, is the dominant index in the space. It's been around for many years. And most of the index-linked contracts today are actually tied to the SCFI. So how does NYFI compare to the SCFI? Well, the first difference is that SCFI is published by the Shanghai Shipping Exchange based in China. NYFI is published by the New York Shipping Exchange, or NYSHEX, based here in the USA. SCFI is based on quoted rates at the time of booking, although the new SCFIS, which was recently rolled out, is actually based on shipped on board invoiced rates, which is very similar to NYFI. So the traditional SCFI is different. The SCFI is a lot more similar. And as I already mentioned multiple times, is the NYFI rates are based on the invoiced rates shipped on board or gated in for those FMC trades, given the rate calculation date is always based on a gate-in date for FMC. The third difference is SCFI is limited to Shanghai exports, whereas NYFI is global. The fourth difference is, in fact, not that different at all, and SCFI is based on ocean freight or mandatory surcharges such as bunker, but excludes all local and landside charges. This is exactly how NYFI is structured, and if you go to the methodology link on the NYFI page, you can download and see specifically a breakdown of each of these charges. And then finally, again, not a big difference, but important point of comparison is the SCFI-S has the ability to do hedging using the International Energy Exchange based in China, which works very well if you're a Chinese company and you have capital requirements, margin requirements set up with the International Energy Exchange. However, if you're operating outside of the Chinese market, then NYFI allows you to hedge your index-linked contracts outside of China using the Intercontinental Exchange. The language got cut off here, but it's the Intercontinental Exchange, which is the exchange that we are using for the purpose of hedging. And when we look at all of the data around the NYFI versus the SCFI, you can see, for example, on the Asia to US East Coast rate, the correlation is very high, 98.2%. On the Asia to US West Coast rate, it's 97.6%. And on the Asia to North Europe, it's 98% even. Now, keep in mind, this is based on a 2-week time lag. Why is there a 2-week time lag? Well, that's because SCFI is based on rates reported at the time of booking, and typically bookings are made 2 to 3 weeks before the gate-in or the departure date. So that's why there's that time lag. But once you account for that time lag, that's where you see the correlation is in fact quite similar. So if you're accustomed to SCFI, by definition, NYFI rates should be very similar to that. So that's it. I hope you get some value out of using this contract simulator. If you have any questions or you need some help with some of the formulas or better understanding how to use it, feel free to reach out to us. We're very happy to help you use this.